The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there.
Welcome to Unraveling. This is a podcast that explores the world through the lens of mental health. And I'm Mary Wilson. We're so happy to have you listening. I am a former journalist.
And I'm Kurt White, a psychotherapist and social worker. And together we like to explore various topics and talk to interesting people who have something to say about mental health in our world and the way that we look at things and look at ourselves. And we're going to be doing some of that today in a very interesting realm. But first, let me ask you a couple of questions, Mary.
Sure.
What are you going to have for dinner tonight?
Oh, we're going to make something on the barbecue, probably hamburgers.
Oh, sounds good. What about this weekend? What are you up to?
Oh, plans this weekend. I think we're going to go to the lake and maybe take a swim. It's supposed to be hot.
Yeah. And when's the last time you thought about death and your own mortality?
Wow. Yeah, that one really hits a little stronger than those other questions, Kurt.
Right, yeah. I get that a lot, But, it's kind of a thing I think we don't think as much about, do we?
We don't. And I've definitely fallen into the camp of feeling invincible, being in denial, not even liking to mention the word death because it makes me personally uncomfortable, and I think so many of us. But I guess the first time that I did kind of have to confront the possibility that maybe this was it was having some complications during childbirth just 10 months ago. Really made me wonder, I was bringing a life into the world and I was having some health problems and wondered, would this be it for me? But thankfully it wasn't. But it did bring me to that place of realizing, hey, we're not all here forever. We all have our own expiration date, right?
Yeah, it's an evocative enough topic that it automatically brings up a lot of very powerful and primitive, we might even say, psychological mechanisms. We block out the thought. We get a little sleepy and want to tune our attention away and start thinking about what we're going to do next. Or we sort of start to get into magical thinking where we think, I'm going to bargain with it. If I think about it in a certain way, then surely it won't happen to me or anybody I love. But maybe that kind of denial or avoidance, as some have called it, maybe it has a psychological cost. Maybe it has some unexplored territory that we might actually be able to, by tuning into it, live more active and vital lives by exploring this kind of theme of openness, and openness to that kind of conversation that we might be able to have.
And that is exactly what our guest today, Dr. Katherine McLean, will be speaking about. You had a very interesting conversation with her.
Yes, Dr. McLean is a research scientist with expertise in studying the effects of mindfulness meditation and also psychedelics on cognitive performance, emotional well-being, spirituality, and brain function. She's a former postdoctoral fellow and faculty member at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where she conducted clinical trials of psilocybin, the primary chemical compound in magic mushrooms, as well as other compounds. And this groundbreaking research on psilocybin and personality change suggests that these medicines might enhance this openness to new experiences and promote mental health and emotional well-being throughout the lifespan. And she's also an author, has written this a book, Midnight Water, a psychedelic memoir, which is available now, in which she talks about many of these professional experiences, but also some very personal experiences of loss and her own journey encountering mortality, death, and the human experience in this way.
And we explore that with Dr. McLean. She gets into it in this interview.
She sure does.
I'm so looking forward to it. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, let's get into it. I'm so glad to meet with you here and talk. I feel like we've got to chat a couple of times and we gab like old friends. So I'm especially interested to welcome you to the podcast today. And
thank you.
So we wanted to talk today a bit about end of life sorts of issues. And I know this is a particular interest of yours. And maybe that's just a place to start. How did you first get interested in this as an issue?
It's one of those things that when a life event happens, as an adult, you start looking back to your childhood and ask, was there a seed of this somewhere? Yeah. And I was one of those kids who was interested in hanging out in graveyards, This is a weird thing, but in my town, there were old Revolutionary War graveyards, and I was really fascinated by the names, the dates, the fact that people had lived hundreds of years ago and they were still kind of around as people that I could meet. I never really had to encounter death directly until I was a young adult. I think the first pet I lost, was when I was in college, and I wasn't even there for the dog's death. I had a sprinkling of memories from grandparents, great-grandparents, early childhood pets that were mostly my parents dying. And so I think, like many people, I was naive to these encounters. They were just things that happened, but they were very tangential to my life. And then when my sister got breast cancer, she was only 26.
What's her name, by the way?
Her name is Rebecca.
Yeah.
And of course, she was told it will be cured. You'll go into remission, which she did. And then 3 years after her first diagnosis, she was being rushed to the hospital. And as cancer sometimes does, it had exploded throughout her body. And it was a trial by fire for me to see what end-of-life care looks like, especially for someone who is unprepared. The doctors don't want the person to die. They don't want to give up hope. So to take the listeners into her hospital room, imagine a very healthy-looking, beautiful, vibrant, courageous person who appears like she's not actually going to die soon. She appeared mostly healthy, and the doctors are saying, we're just going to try this next round of chemo, and we'll get her home, shortly after the new year. This was early January when she went back into the hospital, just after Christmas. It's super cold out. We're in New York City. We're at one of the best cancer hospitals in the world. And so when the doctors are saying, she looks really healthy, we're going to do this chemo and some radiation, and then she's going to be home with her daughter, for a week or so, we believed that. At the same time, both my sister and I were seeing the reality, which was she was getting worse. Her breathing was getting harder. Her pain was getting more intense. At some point, she asked, am I crazy or am I dying? Like, why won't they just say it? So the final days of her life went very, very quickly. It was probably a Wednesday or a Thursday when we last checked in with her doctor, and he said, the tumors aren't too numerous to count, and this would be the time when you should start kind of getting your final wishes in place. And then by Monday, she was at death's doorstep. Finally, the palliative care team had joined on. She got to say goodbye to her parents, her husband. Her daughter was able to come before things got really scary. So her daughter's last memory of her mom was this lovely, kind of normal visit eating ice cream in the waiting room. A beautiful sunset. From her daughter at 4 years old, her perspective was, Mommy's fine. I'll see her again. And that girl now is 16, and it's amazing. It's like it is actually possible to encounter death as a young person and have it not be traumatic. It was harder for the adults.
Yes, yeah.
Much harder. In that final 24 hours, so much transpired. And ultimately, what it came down to was she wanted to be comfortable as much as possible, which meant a lot of morphine. And she wanted it not to be drawn out. And the palliative care team understands that, but they were only kind of allowed into the room at the final minute, the last day. And so what I took out of that was, a lot of people know exactly how they want to die. And the palliative care people are the ones who are trained to do that. And the curative people, the oncologists and everyone who's trying really hard to treat someone, it's kind of not their territory. And so if we can kind of work on that shift of the passing of the baton, it's like we've done all we can. Now she gets to do this amazing thing, which is encounter death. And so strangely, in that 6-week period, I got a glimpse of both how, things go very badly for patients and doctors and families, but also the potential for great beauty. I think that's the thing that makes my perspective unique in all of this, because most people don't see the beauty in death naturally. And so I'm very thankful that I did, because then it set me on a course of just continuing to look for that kind of beauty in these tragic moments for people.
I read about it in your book, but I wonder if you could describe a little bit about that encounter with the beauty.
Sure.
I found it very moving in the way that you wrote about it, and I would love to hear you talk about it a little bit.
Right. Well, for some context, I was working at Johns Hopkins at the time. I was a researcher studying psychedelic compounds. And I had been trained to sit with people encountering the edge of what they knew up until that point. So in a way, what they were experiencing at Hopkins was like death. But I didn't quite connect the two until I was with my sister, and I was like, oh, this idea of death is something that we encounter in these threshold moments. It doesn't have to be physical death. It could be the death of what you know to be true about yourself. It could be the death of an old version of yourself. And so when my sister went into the hospital, I connected what I had been trained to do at Hopkins with what she needed in her hospital room. And of course, there was trial and error, but a lot of it was the same. So being able to sit quietly in a room with someone who needs your care and attention, but doesn't want you interfering with their experience, that was the same. Having beautiful images around the room, like flowers and music that the person likes, that was the same. What I was missing in the hospital setting was a team of people who were on board with this beautiful vision. So that's what we had developed at Hopkins, a whole team of people whose entire job it was to make sure that each person had an experience with psilocybin that would be maybe challenging, maybe scary, but certainly a beautiful thing that they had gone through.
Well, I was really struck, in your writing about it and now in describing it, that actually that sort of treatment-oriented medical world was not even really oriented to reality, right? I mean, that was part of what was painful about it. And I've seen this before, too. I think in my own mother's death to a slightly lesser extent, but I can remember the oncologist saying, like, he thought so many people died just because we weren't trying hard enough. We should just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. And what do you think that's about?
It's a great question. I've wondered that myself. I still remember the conversation with the oncologist, and I saw how sad and the pain in his eyes, that he knew what he wanted to say, but he was saying something else. We didn't have the time then, and certainly doctors get very nervous if you reach out afterward because they're like, oh gosh, upset family members. That's the last thing that we want to deal with. But I felt like there was a lost opportunity to repair that relationship and to give feedback to the doctor and say, we actually would have experienced a lot of relief if you could have just said what you really wanted to say.
What do you think he wanted to say?
I think he wanted to say, like, I'm sorry, we've tried what we can, and this has taken a turn that we weren't expecting.
Yeah.
And I don't know that oncologists are trained to have that conversation. And maybe they feel like they've failed. Thinking about the psychedelic work, I wonder if caregivers and doctors could also benefit, because if he could have seen the potential that I saw, I don't know that he would have felt so much like he had failed.
So what did he say instead, by the way? He didn't say what he really wanted to, but what did he do instead that was...
Well, so I remember looking at the scan together. I said, can I see the most recent scan of her lungs? Because she's having a lot of trouble breathing. And he said, well, as you can see, the tumors are too numerous to count. So that was like a very objective thing that he felt safe saying. And I said, well, is it something that alone the tumors could make it so she can't breathe anymore? And he was reluctant to say that, but he did say she could get an infection. The cancer could spread to her brain or spinal cord where the chemo won't work. But he couldn't say that third thing, which is the cancer itself, despite our treatment, has progressed to a point that we can't win anymore. Yeah. He also said, I'm an eternal optimist. I mean, that's great. And still, when everyone in the room is acting like everything is going to be fine, but the person knows they're dying, that causes a major break in that relationship.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned about psychedelic work, and of course, I know a little about this because that's how we encountered each other. But maybe for the listeners, you could talk a little bit about what did that work involve for you, and what is this link between it and this sort of idea of dying? Because I don't know that everyone would think of that there is a sort of a link there.
Right. Okay, so when I encounter someone new and I don't know their background, I often ask if they've heard of either mushrooms or LSD. Most people have heard of LSD, but they usually have a bad idea about it because of what our culture went through, the hippie movement. It's taken on a mythical status now. But usually people have also heard of mushrooms, and they often think about mushrooms are related to cannabis, like pot. So what I'll usually say is mushrooms are used often by teenagers and young people as recreational drugs. But we've also found that the chemical in mushrooms at a fairly high dose helps people have breakthrough experiences. The two kind of core life experiences that most people have had, either present for someone's birth or present for someone's death, I say, you know how when you were around, your baby being born and time kind of changed, the day felt very long, you felt a lot of emotions, you felt overwhelming love and connection for this being that you had just met. Everyone took time away from their normal routine to make sure the baby was well cared for. They'll say, oh yeah, I understand that. I said, well, the mushroom experience can be like that for someone. And the person they're encountering is not a baby, but themselves. And then if someone's been with someone who's dying, it's even an easier jump, because I said, you know how you dropped everything to be with that person, whether it was for a day or an hour. And maybe that person talked a lot about what was important to them. Maybe they just wanted to be comfortable and you sat and watched them breathe. Maybe you were lucky enough to be there when they died and felt that poignant emotion of letting go of a life. I said, well, so mushrooms can sometimes be like that for people. And sometimes, despite my best efforts, people don't have a reference. They don't have a touchstone. And it's one of the things that I would love to see the psychedelic movement work toward, is how can we connect what we know from the research to people's everyday lives. So at Hopkins, we were working with people who had usually never had a psychedelic experience before, but they were already practicing meditation. They already went to church, some kind of spiritual framework for these big life experiences. And it was only later on when I was working there that we started taking in people who were more kind of atheists or scientists. Of course, I think that these experiences are safe for all humans, but because our culture doesn't train us to encounter these extreme states of being, it can be easier to start with folks who have some idea. What happens when you sit in meditation? What happens when you pray? What happens when you go to church and you feel the presence of something beyond yourself?
And one of the things that's been researched is specifically related to the use of psilocybin for people with anxiety about death and dying. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Right. So that's the most obvious connection.
Yeah.
The study that was happening at Hopkins when I was there was with cancer patients. The requirement was you had to have a terminal diagnosis, which means a doctor thinks that you have 6 months or less to live, and you have either anxiety or depression related to your diagnosis. So it was a very narrow definition of who could get into this study. And on top of that, you had to be healthy enough to make it through the study. So it's kind of a hard thing for someone to qualify for.
Yeah.
The patients that I saw come in that really stood out to me were folks who, I think like my sister, healthy looking from the outside, but just tormented on the inside. How is this the end of my life? How has this happened to me? How do I say goodbye? What do I do for the next 6 months? Like, how does a person live knowing they're going to die? So these were the fundamental questions they were bringing to our therapy group. I remember this one person in particular, this very tall, fit, boisterous man. And when he ingested psilocybin for the first time, his body just went into full-blown panic, like a roller coaster, but you don't know where the roller coaster is going. We can't know what the roller coaster will make you feel. We can't know the twists and turns of your own psyche, but we know the basic safety of the mechanism. Mostly it's just trust, let go, and be open to what's coming. And so that became like a mantra for a lot of our participants. Trust, let go, be open. And the presence of a guide. Now that could be a therapist, but it could be a chaplain. It could be a death doula. And when that man came out of his session at the end of the day, I mean, he was glowing. It felt like he just dropped a big burden that he had been carrying, not knowing how to do this next thing, and that he was able to just put that down. And I thought, okay, maybe psilocybin can be used for a medical treatment. Like there is a possibility here. It's not just something that's interesting to some people for spiritual reasons. Maybe there's a real medical application here.
And maybe what it's doing is helping people reorient to something that they're moving away from in terms of their own internal experience. And it allowed them to sort of be open to it in a different way.
Well, right. I mean, like I have a fear of flying.
Mm-hmm.
Seems so silly, right? People fly in planes all the time. Why does it cause me to feel like I am going to explode? Some people have that level of fear about things. And I would say a lot of people have it about death. On the one hand, people with anxiety get to practice this all the time. We get nervous in situations that are not dangerous. But we don't really train people to practice being scared and moving through that until they reach a point where they have a terminal diagnosis or a loved one dies or they're in a car crash. And so I kind of look at psilocybin as practice for this inevitable moment, knowing that you're moving into something unknown and still going through it and coming out the other side.
And you were able to use that framework and understanding to sort of bring the energy of that to your sister and her death experience.
Right. And it's interesting. So my sister, I think she believed in something, but she wasn't sure what. And one day I asked her, I said, do you have any wishes for after death? And she was like, why would that matter? And I said, well, I don't know. I think about it all the time. And she said, it doesn't matter if I go to hell, heaven, or nothing. As long as my husband and daughter are happy, that's what matters to me. So it was illuminating for me to ask that question, right? Because sometimes we think that the person needs to have some assurance of where they're going to go. But for her family being happy was the thing that mattered the most to her. So in a way, she had a lot of peace about that. But then I remember when her consciousness started changing, and this was maybe in the last 24 to 36 hours before death. And death doulas, hospice workers see this a lot. Even atheists, ordinary people, scientists, materialists will start seeing things, hearing things, their consciousness shifts. Doing the psychedelic research, I said, yeah, of course, this is what consciousness does at these thresholds. It's not shocking. But for a regular person, it could be like, what do you mean she sees her dead grandmother in the room? What do you mean she's asking for instructions on how to go to this next place? She did. She started asking questions about what she was seeing and feeling that was pointing to something beyond her ordinary reality. I felt that the psychedelic training helped me encourage her to move toward those things, that I didn't see them as scary or weird. Someone else might see that as very disconcerting.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and it might be that not everyone has an interest in psychedelics, or even they might not have an interest in transcendent experiences or even peak experiences. But at some point, death comes knocking, right. And so we have to think of it at some point. I mean, and I wonder if you have a different perspective on how people might carry the awareness of their own death in terms of how we choose to live our life and do what we do with the time we have.
Right.
Whether it's limited in a very finite sense or limited in a slightly more expansive sense.
Yeah. When my sister got sick and died, it was a 6-week period from basically diagnosis, discovery of the cancer that had spread, to death. So during that first year after she died, I really became acutely aware of that 1 month or 2 month time frame. That short time frame, that real mystical time frame of living in the now is really hard for a lot of people in our culture. But it brought me to my one big question, which was, what would I do if I only had 1 or 2 months left to live? And so I kind of explored that time frame for a while. And then once I had kids, I had to extend the time frame. So then I started asking, well, how would I live if I had 1 or 2 years left? So I started kind of asking that longer question, how would I really live if I had a few years left to live? And then finally, as my children got older and I realized, wow, 10 years just passed from when my sister died until now, I started asking, how would I live if I had 10 years? And so these 3 time frames became questions that I now ask others. And so I ask, instead of telling people what they need to do to get ready to die, how would you live if you knew you had 1 or 2 months left? And then each person gets to decide what the answer is. Now, maybe there is no answer and it really freaks them out. Well, that's information. Now, 1 or 2 years, well, that's sometimes easier for people to answer. They can really grasp, wow, I would probably quit this job that's driving me crazy because I wouldn't worry so much about not having money to pay my mortgage after 2 years. I might spend more time with my kids because, wow, in 2 years, they're not going to have me anymore. So I want those last memories to be really good ones. So that's information. And then the 10-year question, what legacy do you want to leave? What gift is your life if you have a decade or longer?
But I find that very powerful, because I think it orients a person to their relationship in time in a different way. Mm-hmm. I've said to people in the past that like loss and orientation to one's mortality are different things in a way. Loss is about a relationship and the ending of it and the mourning of it. But mortality is really about our relationship with time and infinity. I think, what are we doing here, and how does it seem to us that it won't be that way? In a forever way. Looking back at the last 10 years, what do you know now that you didn't know then?
The most important thing I know, which no adult was willing to tell me, and maybe they didn't know, was that when you let go of the thing that you know for sure is going to produce happiness, success, a good life, as soon as you let go of that, a new thing enters. All of these opportunities are just waiting in the wings and just want to jump into that space. I tell this to people and they're like, that can't be how life works. And I was like, well, I've had the privilege and the freedom to explore this. And I can tell you every time this is how it works. Now, that isn't to say that I don't fall into the same trap of believing that like now I found the thing, I need to hold on to it. But then I said, remember when you left Hopkins and you weren't sure how you were going to pay the bills or what was going to, and then an opportunity emerged. Remember when you did this other thing and then an opportunity emerged. So that's the main thing that I think the feeling less driven by fear has enabled me in my life, is to be open to new opportunities that I couldn't see until I let go of the thing that I was holding on to.
That's interesting. A real parallel with the letting go at the end in a way.
Well, exactly, right? It's like being close to death is very practical. I luckily haven't been stuck in a certain rut for too long because I know the signs. And I'm like, when I start getting more anxiety, I can't sleep at night, I start getting more angry during the day, those are signs from my body that I'm trying to hold on to something too hard and I need to let go. And then when I let go, it makes room for joy. It makes room for all of these fun things, which is the same as death. People think the fear is what's coming, but the fear is letting go of the thing that you think you can't hold on to anymore.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing so much about your personal and professional experiences here. I found it really deeply enriching and moving.
I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
Thank thank you again to Dr. Katherine McLean for that very moving and powerful conversation. And joining us again is Mary, who's been listening along. And I'm curious, Mary, we started the conversation today, me asking you a question about when was the last time you thought about mortality, death, and dying. And you gave a very personal answer to it, that actually you did have an encounter with this not very long ago. I wonder, how has listening to this today changed your thinking or not about that experience or your own experience of life going forward?
Yeah, I think it was a really powerful interview, and it really makes you put things in perspective when you're forced to think through some of those mental exercises that she proposed, those questions. What would you do in your life if you only had 1 month left, if you only had 2 years left? And I think there is a big benefit to thinking about that, because we want to live our life to the fullest when we think that way, right? We don't want to be doing things that we don't want to do. We want to spend all the time we can with our children and our loved ones. And I definitely identified with her sister, who really didn't have too many wishes for, after she passed away, other than the happiness of her husband and her child.
Yeah. What's the legacy of the impact you've had on the people you've loved and had relationships with in this life?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Kurt, I know you've had some personal experiences of being close to people who have died. Did any of this bring up things for you?
Oh, goodness, yes. My answer to that question would have been a little unfair. I think about death and dying probably more than most people. It could be an occupational hazard, but there's an old short story I remember about a couple who had a sort of magical knowledge that the world was going to end in the middle of the night. It wasn't going to hurt. It wasn't going to be dramatic. It was just going to end. And they talk about that for a bit, and then one of them realizes that the sink is dripping. And then the question is, do you get up to shut off the sink or don't you? And he does, actually, right? So I think sometimes it's not so much about what would we do differently, but about what meaning would we make of things? How could we feel the feelings we're having? How could we understand the importance of relationships so that we're not sort of running from anxieties that didn't matter anyway? Her talk about her sister's sort of, this very powerful life and business, and yet when death was at the door, none of that meant anything, actually, right? It doesn't, matters about money don't matter so much after death. So it's things like that, I think, is sort of an energy of it. It has made me sort of wish to not just abide in denial anymore.
I think that conversation helped me start to think about it. And like you said, it's going to be an ongoing thought in my mind now. And I'm very appreciative that she brought some of these ideas up.
And so am I, and thank you so much for being here with me today, Mary, and thank you also again to Dr. McLean. If people are interested in learning more about her and her work, you can find her at katherinemclean.org. We'll have a link in the show notes where you can find excerpts from her book and other talks, and I hope people check that out because I think it's very valuable.
Me too.
Unraveling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat and is produced by Charts and Leisure.
Find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Mary Wilson.
And I'm Kurt White. We'll see you again soon.
Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.